Everyone thinks they know why Patton was sidelined in World War II. He slapped a soldier, he lost his command, end of story. That's not what happened. Not even close. What actually happened was a 3-month secret operation, run by Eisenhower himself, to save the one general he believed could win the war. A cover-up involving classified medical reports, silenced journalists, and a personal appeal to 3 reporters to kill the story for the good of the country. It worked. For 90 days it worked perfectly. And then one radio broadcast on a Sunday evening tore the whole thing apart and nearly cost the Allies their most dangerous weapon. August 3, 1943, the 15th Evacuation Hospital near Nicosia, Sicily. Private Charles Kuhl of the 26th Infantry Regiment is sitting on a cot. He's shaking. He has a fever of 102 degrees. Chronic dysentery, and after weeks of continuous combat in the Sicilian mountains, his mind has reached a place his body left behind days ago. The medical term is combat fatigue. Today we'd call it what it is: acute psychological trauma from sustained exposure to combat. General George S. Patton walks into the ward. He's visiting wounded soldiers, a routine morale stop for senior commanders. He moves bed to bed, shaking hands with men who have shrapnel wounds, bullet holes, missing limbs. Men who bled for the victory Patton just delivered in Sicily. Then he reaches Kuhl's bed, and he sees a soldier with no bandages, no wounds, just shaking hands and hollow eyes. Patton asks what's wrong. Kuhl answers, "I guess I can't take it." 3 seconds of silence, then Patton explodes. He calls Kuhl a coward. He slaps him across the face with his gloves. He screams that he won't have cowards sharing a hospital with brave men who bled for their country. Then he orders Kuhl thrown out of the tent. Medical officers stand frozen. Nobody moves. Nobody speaks. The most celebrated American general in the war has just assaulted a sick man in a hospital bed. 7 days later, August 10th, a different hospital, the same general. Private Paul Bennett of the 17th Field Artillery has been admitted for severe anxiety after days of relentless German shelling. When Patton asks what's wrong, Bennett whispers, "It's my nerves. I can't stand the shelling anymore." This time Patton goes further. He slaps Bennett twice. Then he pulls his ivory-handled pistol, the same weapon he wears like a cavalryman's badge of honor, and waves it in Bennett's face. He screams that he ought to shoot him right here for cowardice. Medical staff physically step between the general and the patient to prevent further violence. This time, the doctors don't stay silent. 2 medical officers, Lieutenant Colonel Perrin Long and Colonel Donald Currier, file formal complaints, detailed, documented, witnessed. They submit them through medical channels directly to Supreme Allied Headquarters, directly to Eisenhower's desk. And when Eisenhower reads those reports, his reaction isn't what anyone expects. August 16th, 1943. Algiers. Eisenhower reads the reports twice. Then he puts his head in his hands. His chief of staff, General Walter Bedell Smith, gives him the obvious advice: fire Patton. The incidents are indefensible. If the press finds out, the damage will be catastrophic. Cut him loose now. Control the narrative. Eisenhower says no. He tells Smith that Patton is too valuable to lose. 7th Army just completed the most successful American operation of the war. The invasion of Italy is being planned. Future operations will need exactly the kind of commander Patton is: aggressive, fast, terrifying to the enemy. But Eisenhower also knows something else. What Patton did was wrong, not questionable, not debatable. Wrong, it violated military law, it violated everything the American military claims to stand for. So Eisenhower does something no one anticipates. He doesn't fire Patton, he doesn't ignore the problem, he builds a plan to save him. On August 17th, Eisenhower writes Patton a letter that becomes one of the most severe reprimands ever delivered to a senior American officer. He calls Patton's conduct despicable. He warns that it could have resulted in a court-martial. He states that if anything like this happens again, Patton goes home in disgrace. But buried inside that devastating letter is the lifeline. Eisenhower writes that he is retaining Patton in command because military necessity requires it. The letter was a masterpiece of political engineering. It was punishment, and it was a shield. If the story ever broke, Eisenhower could point to this letter and say, "I took action, I addressed it, and here's why I kept him." Eisenhower's strategy had three components, and each one was as calculated as any battlefield operation he'd ever planned. First, force Patton to apologize, publicly, to the soldiers he hit, to the medical staff who witnessed it, to every division in 7th Army. Make the apology so extensive that if the story broke, the response was already on record. Second, lock down the information, classify the medical reports, remind everyone who knew to keep their mouths shut under operational security. Third, and this was the gamble, if reporters found out, appeal to their patriotism, ask them to kill the story for the good of the war effort. Patton carried out the apologies, and for a man who lived on audacity and dominance, it was torture. He visited both soldiers in their hospitals, he met with the medical officers and acknowledged his behavior was wrong. Then he traveled to every single division headquarters in 7th Army and apologized to assembled troops. Officers who witnessed it said Patton was unrecognizable, subdued, speaking in a quiet voice that didn't sound like him. A man swallowing his own pride, one division at a time. And then silence. August passed, September, October. The story stayed inside military channels. No press coverage, no headlines, no scandal. Eisenhower's containment strategy was working. 3 months of carefully managed silence. But Eisenhower knew it was fragile. American war correspondents were embedded throughout the 7th Army. Dozens of people knew the story. Medical staff, division commanders, soldiers who'd watched the apologies. Every day that passed was one more day the secret could break. In November, 3 reporters walked into his headquarters, and the fragile silence began to crack. November 1943, 3 American correspondents, Damari Bess of the Saturday Evening Post, Merrill Mueller of NBC, and Quentin Reynolds of Collier's, approach Eisenhower's headquarters. They've heard rumors, they want confirmation. Eisenhower meets them personally. No aides, no handlers. Just the Supreme Commander and 3 reporters who hold Patton's career in their hands. Eisenhower doesn't deny it. He confirms everything, the slaps, the pistol, the threats. Then he tells the reporters what he's done, the reprimand, the apologies, the monitoring. And then he makes his appeal. Patton is essential to winning this war. German commanders fear him more than any other Allied general. Future operations that will save American lives, require his aggressive leadership. If this story runs, Patton goes home, and the enemy benefits. Eisenhower looks at 3 journalists and asks them, directly, to kill the story. For the country. All 3 agree. They file the story, but ask their editors not to publish. Military necessity, patriotic reasons, protect operations that will save American lives. The editors comply. The story is killed. Eisenhower's strategy has survived its most dangerous test. The journalists who had every right to publish chose not to. The secret holds. But there's one journalist Eisenhower doesn't know about, and he doesn't play by the same rules. Drew Pearson, the most influential and most feared columnist in America. His Washington merry-go-round column ran in hundreds of newspapers. His radio broadcast reached millions. He specialized in one thing: tearing open the secrets that powerful people wanted buried. In November 1943, a source inside the War Department hands him everything: the slaps, the pistol, the cover-up. Eisenhower's decision to protect Patton despite formal complaints from medical officers. November 21, 1943. A Sunday evening, millions of American families are gathered around their radios for Drew Pearson's weekly broadcast. What they hear next will trigger the biggest military scandal of the war. Pearson reveals everything, both slapping incidents, Patton pulling his pistol on a hospitalized soldier, the threats to shoot a man seeking medical treatment, and the detail that transforms a scandal into a crisis. That Eisenhower knew, that Eisenhower chose not to fire him, that the Supreme Commander had been covering for Patton for 3 months, 90 days of careful containment, destroyed in one broadcast. The next morning, every newspaper in America runs the story, front page, above the fold. Patton slaps soldier, General strikes sick GI, and the headline Eisenhower feared most: Eisenhower knew and kept him in command. The reaction is immediate, it's overwhelming, and it is absolutely merciless. Congress erupts. Senators demand Patton's immediate dismissal and court-martial. Senator Robert Reynolds of North Carolina calls for criminal charges. Senator Edwin Johnson of Colorado says Patton's behavior is beneath contempt. Representatives demand Eisenhower explain why a general who assaulted 6 soldiers still has a command. But the pressure that nearly broke Eisenhower didn't come from Congress. It came from the mailroom. The War Department is flooded with letters and telegrams. Mothers write that they refuse to send their sons to serve under a general who assaults his own men. Veterans write that Patton has disgraced the uniform. Civic organizations pass formal resolutions demanding his removal. This isn't political pressure anymore. This is a nation, a democracy, telling its military what it will and will not tolerate. And the message is clear. We don't care how many battles he wins. You don't hit our sons. Secretary of War Henry Stimson is called to testify before Congress. The question is blunt. Why is Patton still in command? Stimson's answer satisfies no one. He says Eisenhower handled it appropriately. That military commanders must balance discipline with operational necessity. Then Stimson says the words that seal Patton's fate. He acknowledges that if public outcry continues, Patton's position becomes untenable regardless of military considerations. The message to Eisenhower is unmistakable. Washington can't protect Patton anymore. The political cost has exceeded the military value. Eisenhower drafts a public statement defending his decision. He sends it to General George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, for approval. Marshall's response is 2 words: "Don't release it. The political situation is too volatile. Any defense of Patton will only amplify the scandal." Marshall tells Eisenhower to say nothing. Let the War Department absorb the congressional pressure. Focus on military operations. Hope the story dies. The story doesn't die, it gets worse. New details leak. Patton's private statements to subordinates reach the press. His belief that combat fatigue is cowardice, that soldiers claiming psychological wounds should be shot, that strict discipline demands harsh treatment of weakness. These quotes destroy the narrative that Patton learned from his mistake. The New York Times writes that Patton has demonstrated unfitness for command of American soldiers. The Washington Post declares that no military consideration justifies retaining a general who brutalizes enlisted men. Public opinion, which had been divided, hardens into something unanimous and unforgiving. January 1944. Eisenhower is desperate. He needs Patton, not just for future combat, but for something no one outside the highest levels of command knows about yet. Operation Overlord, the invasion of France, and the deception plan that will make it work. Eisenhower proposes a compromise. Remove Patton from 7th Army Command, give Congress and the public their pound of flesh. But keep him in England. Use him as the centerpiece of a massive deception operation designed to convince the Germans that the invasion will come at Pas de Calais, not Normandy. The compromise reaches President Roosevelt. His response is characteristically pragmatic. It will work if Patton stays quiet and the press moves on. But if Patton creates another scandal, or if the story stays alive, he goes home permanently. No second chances. Eisenhower gets his authorization. Patton loses his army, but he stays in the war. Now Eisenhower needed the gamble to pay off. And over the next 12 months, Patton would repay Eisenhower's faith in ways that nobody could have predicted. Spring 1944, Southeast England. George Patton, the most aggressive combat general of the war, is commanding an army that doesn't exist. FUSAG, the 1st United States Army Group. Fake tanks made of inflatable rubber. Wooden aircraft on dummy airfields. Radio traffic generated by a handful of operators to simulate an entire army group. It was humiliating, and it was brilliant. German intelligence took the bait completely. They tracked Patton's location obsessively. Their logic was simple and exactly what Eisenhower counted on. The Allies would never waste their best general on a secondary operation. Wherever Patton was, that's where the main invasion would come. Patton was in southeast England, directly across from Pas de Calais, so the Germans positioned their best panzer reserves at Calais and waited for Patton to come. June 6, 1944. The real invasion hits Normandy, 150 miles from where the Germans expected it, and the critical panzer divisions that could have crushed the landings on the first day. They're sitting at Calais, waiting for Patton, waiting for an invasion that will never come. For weeks after D-Day, the Germans still believed Normandy was a diversion. They kept their reserves at Calais, because they were certain the real attack, Patton's attack, was still coming. It never came, and thousands of Allied soldiers who would have died on those beaches lived, because Eisenhower kept Patton in the war. August 1944. Patton finally gets his real command. Third Army becomes operational in France, and the result is the most devastating American offensive of the entire war. In 2 weeks, Third Army covers more ground than every other Allied force managed in 2 months of Normandy fighting. German commanders send increasingly panicked messages to Berlin. Patton is everywhere. moving faster than intelligence can track, appearing behind defensive positions before the defenders know they've been flanked. But Patton's most extraordinary moment, the one that proved Eisenhower right beyond any argument, came 4 months later, in the frozen Ardennes. December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive, smashes through Allied lines in the Ardennes. Complete surprise. American units surrounded, the strategic situation threatening to unravel months of progress. Eisenhower calls an emergency meeting at Verdun. He looks at his commanders and asks one question: how fast can you counterattack? Most generals talk about weeks, redeployment, logistics, planning. Patton says 2 words: 48 hours. Every general in the room thinks he's bluffing. You cannot turn an entire army 90 degrees and attack on a completely different axis in 48 hours. The logistics alone should take weeks. Patton does it. 250,000 men, tens of thousands of vehicles, pivoting north through winter conditions. The relief of Bastogne comes on December 26th. The German offensive is broken. That is the general Eisenhower saved. That is what would have been lost if the press had its way in November 1943. After the war, Allied intelligence asked captured German generals one question: which Allied commander did you fear most? The answer was unanimous. Patton, Field Marshal von Rundstedt, commander of all German forces in the West, called Patton the Allied general they feared above all others. General Fritz Bayerlein said Patton was the only Allied commander with the instincts of a German panzer leader. The enemy confirmed what Eisenhower had believed all along. Patton was irreplaceable, and the decision to save him, despite the political cost, may have been the single most important personnel decision of the war. Eisenhower spent the rest of his life defending that decision. In his memoirs, written 20 years later, he argued that war creates impossible moral choices, that commanders must balance competing values. That judgment means accepting imperfect solutions. But Eisenhower never claimed what he did was morally right, only that it was militarily necessary. He acknowledged the compromise. He accepted that protecting Patton meant tolerating conduct he personally found reprehensible. And he wrote one line that captures everything: "I did what I thought was right for the war effort, but I'll be second-guessed for the rest of my life." Private Paul Bennett survived the war. He went home. He lived a quiet life. History doesn't record whether he ever learned that the general who put a pistol in his face went on to become the most celebrated American commander of the war, or that the Supreme Commander personally fought for 3 months to make sure that General kept his job. History doesn't record whether Bennett ever made peace with what happened in that hospital tent. Some costs don't show up in casualty reports. History is never clean. The decisions that win wars are rarely the decisions that let people sleep at night. If you want the stories that go deeper than the textbooks, the impossible choices, the human costs, and the moments that decided everything, subscribe to Last Stand History and turn on notifications. New videos every week. Here's the question I can't stop thinking about, and I want your honest answer. If you're Eisenhower, if you're sitting in that chair in Algiers with those 2 reports on your desk, do you fire the best general you have? Or do you protect him, knowing what he did, because you believe the war needs him? There's no clean answer. Drop yours in the comments. This is Last Stand History. We'll see you on the next one.